Hi, this is Laura from Healing with Spirit with your next episode of Triggers and Spiritual Medicine, where we engage in real talk and we address the elephant in the room to a growing sickness in our society, addressing root issues, and provide sustainable solutions. We hope by addressing the intersectionality and connect the dots like a web of many of society's challenges, we can help understand the trauma infection that impacts all areas of our life, whether it's addiction, domestic violence, racism, homelessness, sexual abuse, chronic health issues, cancer, environmental, you name it. We can make a list and go on. This is a collaborative program, and I can't tell you today, I am so excited because L, like we were just talking ahead of time, pretty much is the epitomizes exactly a lot of things in one package of what's happening culturally, societally, politically. And I cannot wait to engage in this conversation. Stay tuned to the end because, in the end, we will offer the spiritual medicine with 3 tips or actionable steps that our listeners can take and implement. And if you aren't already, please become a Patreon supporter to help not only support this podcast, but to support our sacred activism and social justice work in the domestic violence field specifically. And welcome, Elle. Please introduce yourself as we were kind of engaging a little bit ahead of time. So,
Hi, hello, Laura. Hello, listeners. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. As somebody who just grew up an only child and very much feeling like a weirdo as far as all of the layers of their identity, I want to talk about my personal identity. Sometimes I think it's called positionality, but kind of how I am arriving to society and to privilege and to personal experiences to start off. And then we can just kind of start riffing on conversation, I guess, if you would like. So I am Elle, aka Divinat. My business name is DivinatX, Inner and Outer Worlds. I am the identity I prefer to refer to myself is actually agender or gender fluid, but I'm also okay with the non-binary label because it's kind of the mainstream one that a lot of people are used to. So I am a non-binary person who uses they, them pronouns. I also fall a few other places under the LGBTQ plus banner. I may or may not get into that as much today, but I just did want to mention that. Um, let's see. I'm basically a working artist and a small business owner, which is its own fun set of things to juggle. I am currently located in the Los Angeles, California, USA area, aka the unceded indigenous lands of Tongva, Tataviam, and Quiche. And let's see, what else? So the languaging around this has changed over the years, but I think, what would be considered a second generation American. That is, my parents are immigrants. They're immigrants from the country Romania. And I was born here in the US. I also grew up interfaith, with my father Jewish, um, mostly like leaning Reform Reconstructionist, and my mother being Eastern Orthodox Christian. And it's also interesting because as an ethnic identity, my mother found out later in life, really only like in the early 2000s, that ethnically she also has some Jewish heritage, which is interesting for reasons I will get to in a moment. So there's that layer of my identity, and the fact that I grew up interfaith, not just kind of like with my parents going to their own services, but I was taken to services for both of those religions. Um, and that was a whole interesting bucket of experiences. Um, I do identify kind of as ethnically or culturally Jewish, not necessarily religiously. I am also a very light-skinned, white-presenting person. So I personally have definitely lived a life uh, full of white privilege. And to, a certain degree, class privilege as well, where I grew up. I was sort of between parents who eventually got divorced, but between parents was basically kind of between middle class when that existed, which I don't know how much it does anymore, and more towards professional upper middle class, um, at least while I was growing up. So that is a layer to the sandwich of my experiences.
I can totally
Um,
relate to, because I grew up in the dual religious household, so I used to go to two different churches
uh-huh.
depending on who I was with. With the Eastern Orthodox, and my other situation was Catholic.
Mhm.
So, 10 years at Catholic school. So, which, I get it, I actually mourn how I grew up in that sense, because like I'm in the process of watching a series on I think it's Showtime, The Woman in the Wall, which talks about the Magdalene laundries in Ireland,
Mhm.
and to think that the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church were illegally trafficking children for money up until 1996 really hits hard for me, right? So there's all these different tentacles and things that are happening in society, and you come with such a resume of experience and different life experiences and cultural experiences, and I understand, when you have parents that have immigrated, it's also a whole other layer there too, and understanding, because you see things through a different world lens
Mhm.
than just our little neighborhood American lens,
Well,
right?
it's also, I think, even further important for me to notate right now, because this hasn't really um, emerged as an issue in my viewpoint until I've seen like a lot of the rhetoric that's been going around social media kind of for the past few months. But like, I never personally thought that the fact that my parents were specifically immigrants from a repressive regime, basically a dictatorship. And technically, the first members of my family who immigrated here were political asylees. They received a letter of asylum. So I can't pretend that that hasn't, influenced, for example, my views on immigration and such. But also, excuse me, but also, like, the way in which um I see us, in the West, and I'm going to lean towards talking more specifically about the USA, I think, because that has been the primary part of my experience. Whereas I've visited the UK and Europe several times, and obviously visiting isn't, immersing and living there really, but like there are some there are some things that are different there about how things are approached, just for a variety of reasons and depending on where you go. But like, for example, the way in which like certain global, like geopolitical topics tend to kind of glom or polarized towards being politicized as party line issues here in the US. That is something that I have been struggling with quite a bit, because I think of like quote unquote kind of buzzword or buzz phrase here, the concept of quote unquote personal freedoms differently from a lot of people who have had families kind of more assimilated to USA culture, or maybe in some cases Western culture, but I'll focus on the US. I have no problem with that. I think I view it differently because even like a conversation about what is a free society and who gets to prioritize like personal freedoms has been heavily polarized and politicized here in the US. And that is something, as a descendant of people who are immigrants, that I struggle with a lot. And
I
I
know as far as that goes, there's so many, I think, where eyes have been open or opening, right? I call it's like the hard truths. We finally face the hard truths. It's difficult, but you kind of have to face them in order to get to the other side, right? So
right.
I mean, I know, I mean, my grandparents fled from the Bolshevik Revolution,
Hmm.
for two different reasons. But my grandfather fled because he was of the nobility, so he was fleeing from being slaughtered from that. But my grandmother fled because she was of the poverty, and fled because of starvation. And similar thing. Like, I mean, why do most people immigrate to the U.S., right? It's
Hmm.
not usually because everything is hunky dory back home.
Right, right.
There's usually some form of oppressive something that they are experiencing,
Hmm.
and I'm still diving into my Irish side, because there's a big, I know a lot of them one of them came from during the famine,
Yeah.
so, and so there's a lot of, I don't know. I totally, when you wake up, there's a lot to sit with. There's and one of the things I would love to ask you is, around even language and languaging around like your identity of who you are, and you encapsulate so much in your identity, right? Both from an immigration standpoint, from a religious standpoint, from an identity standpoint, all these things. And are all also, by the way, topics of so-called buzz things on the upcoming election.
Mm.
And and I agree, like the one thing I see, at least for me, is I'm starting to question. I don't know if it's like a fact, but more question of the two sides. Are they really two sides? Or are they one side of a different coin with just different voices, but the same people funding them to just kind of placate us and keep doing business as usual. I mean, because we can even go into like the ERA and other things that should be protections that aren't passed, that are impacting our society and culture, and are not passed. Why? Right? I know in my state, domestic violence homicides are up 40% in the last 2 years. The
Mm.
family courts have completely run rampant. Like, my I don't think I cannot stop getting shocked at some of the stories I hear on a daily basis, even what's going on there. I can't speak to the LGBTQ community because I don't represent, but I hear stories from friends of mine that do, and it's just, I don't know. One of the things I see is when we face hard truths, or like the abusers, the more they want to hold on control, it gets worse. But if we keep holding on, and we keep standing our ground, we keep holding our truth on whatever aspect we are, that ultimately does prevail. this is how revolutions are fought, right? This is what happened with the civil rights. This is what happened with women's suffrage, right? We can go back in history. We're at a pivotal time where if we can not bury our heads in the sand, this is the one thing I am seeing on social media,
Mhm.
is people getting stuck in freeze mode or feeling like, well, I can't speak to that. I'm not gonna do anything. It's too much now. It's too much. I just gotta go get my manicure, or I just got, going right back into privilege mode instead of saying, you know what? Understanding like what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Congo, what's happening here, you know, burying our heads in the sand isn't going to fix because it's going to hit home. It does hit home ultimately in your backyard, whether you want to see it or not. So now's the time to take action. And
Can I like jump
sure,
off that with several points?
absolutely.
Okay, so I first I want to speak to the fact that my stepfather is actually Romanian Israeli, and so he has family members who are, you know, basically getting rockets fired towards them on a regular basis. So with that said, like on a personal, like just me level, like let's take a moment to like pull the lens in for one quick second. I have to stand in the space of acknowledging that it is like an impossibility for me to, for example, speak from a removed place or a 100% objective, detached place about the war right now. So there's one truth that I walk around in my body quite a lot every day. And then I also wanted to like jump off the talking point that you brought up about saying stuff, not saying stuff, and that type of thing. We've got a lot going on with that. So first of all, we've got the fact that not just social media, but even if you get news media emailed to you, um, is just a barrage. It's an onslaught. It is like uh, content warning, pardon the analogy, but it's like drinking or eating so much that you make yourself throw up at one time. It is so much for the senses, right? So I think that with all of that incoming information, um, there is nothing to be judged negatively for people who wish to try to take a moment and practice slowness with consuming the information. And you may or may not have been referring to that specifically, but I just kind of want to like jump off that and offer that to your listeners.
Have to
Um,
be able to take that pause. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I
right,
mean,
right. And then in addition to that also,
yeah,
um, and I hope this doesn't sound like totally off the wall tinfoil hat, but this is a massive propaganda war. And sorry if this is hard for people to hear, but propaganda is being churned out in relationship to both groups of people. Okay. Um, you also have external political actors who are not necessarily connected to anything directly on the ground there, but political entities that are that have their own objectives in the mix, you know. So there's that going on. Because for, those of your listeners who are familiar with, and by the way, I choose to use the acronym SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa, to refer to what we sometimes call the Middle East. This is a personal choice. I'm not trying to talk over anybody else's choice, and I'm not trying to talk over the choices of anybody directly affected. But this is something I choose because it is a little more objective, and I feel that it acknowledges some of the minoritized people in the region, uh, as opposed to, for example, a term like the Arab world. And with the term the Middle East, like there's some vestiges of colonialism in there as well. So you could debate about that specific topic all day. I'm not going to go on and on about it, but my personal choice here, and I've definitely had like Swana people yell at me about it and disagree, and that it's absolutely their right to, so thumbs up. But like, um, I choose to use that acronym. So as far as
Actually, do you
the
know,
SWANA,
it's the first time I've heard that term, so I can't even speak to it.
oh,
So I just
okay.
learned something new.
Cool. Well, and hopefully if it's new to your listeners, maybe they will go take a look at it as well. And as with really anything and anybody connected to that region, there's never a monolithic agreement about what to use, and it can depend on the context, but referring to the overall region, like not just the Levant and not just Israel, Palestine, and those territories, referring to the overall region, I prefer to use this one. So anyway, um, oh, there was a point that you brought up that I really wanted to jump off of, and now I totally lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so the fact that we're just like, there's a lot of baggage of this being part of an information war, potentially kind of a propaganda spin leaning war. And about the fact, again, I hope this doesn't sound totally, off the wall tinfoil hat, but like the fact that we have emerged into the era where AIs can manipulate the information. Um, I've definitely not related to the conflict, but like I've definitely just seen like AI accounts with AI generated photos start to follow me, start to look at my stories in Instagram. Um,
It's
huh?
like,
Oh,
it's quite scary, I,
yeah.
especially for people, well, I don't know, I call it my demographic, like the over 50 crowd, because, we grew up without cable, we had to sit down with a phone. I remember like having extra long phone cords, I mean, that's the era I grew up in.
Yeah.
Um, I remember when microwaves first came out. I remember when a DVD player first came out. Okay. So it's like, and now, in like 30 years, we went from like that to like now we got all this stuff that's digitized, and
Yeah.
it's a little overwhelming for people like me,
Yeah,
but
so I
it's
I think, I think it's okay to take that pause. We don't, and I absolutely agree with you, by the way, that some people are just burying their heads in the sand. Um, but at the same
it's an
time, we don't,
opportunity.
uh,
It's an opportunity. Like there's such a huge opportunity to create
mhm,
the kind of shift for humanity.
yes.
And that's what I see is like maybe that's my spirit sense, my spidey
Mhm,
sense,
mhm.
right? It's like here's this golden egg that we all can have. And your fear is making you bury your head in the sand instead. And what I'm trying to say is pick yourself up, have your courage be stronger than your fear, and help us take it to the over to the finish line
Mhm.
so humanity can really recover from what's happening, because really we're talking recovery, right? There's a lot of
Right.
recovery here. There's a lot of healing that has to happen, because you're right.
A whole lot.
Like I don't
Good
think
point.
I don't think I will ever look at the US the same ever again after what I've seen in the last year. um, and even though I've always known the systems of oppression there, I think it's just taken to a whole nother level,
Mhm.
and when people even talk about the immigration coming in from the South, I'm like, yeah, you weren't born yet, but do you remember the Iran Contra affairs? Like, I can just go, do you remember how we interfered with the governments in Central and South America? Like, like, we caused a lot of this. Our government caused a lot of the destabilization in other countries. So,
Absolutely. Yes.
and so there's a lot of healing that has to happen, but there has to be also, I've always firmly believed in order to fully heal, you also have to face the hard truths. The hard truths, you can't heal without acknowledging the hard truths. And the hard truths is, yeah, this country has done, especially in the past 100 years, an
Mhm.
awful lot of damage worldwide. From colonization to imperialism, under the guise of freedom and democracy.
Yeah, and that ties back into, for my own thought process, like it ties back into the perhaps slightly wider, I don't know, I don't want to use that as a point of comparison, but the wide lens I tend to have because I have family members in several countries, and because my parents came from political oppression, it it pulls me back to that question also of looking at the fact that supremacist culture actually pervades every society, regardless of what color that society may dominantly be, um, whether it's a group versus group, whether it's religious minorities that can be targeted and experience an extremely different, uh, lived experience in one place, and privilege in like another part of the world. That's an interesting thing to look at, right? Because, for example, in the Swana in the Middle East, a lot of Christian people are minoritized, throughout, like, if I'm not mistaken, throughout a lot of the movements of the Arab Spring about 10 to 12, 10, 12, 13 years ago, um, Christians were targeted, and also kind of the impetus behind some of the the government overhauls that were happening. Um, and so, like, to just have the ability to kind of pull the lens back, and say, ooh, like, it's not just like whiteness as like we conceptualize whiteness, which is also, by the way, especially compared to like how incredibly ancient places like Africa and the Swana are, right? Like, it's not just like our very recent kind of concept of white supremacy, which has absolutely done a ton of damage, ton of colonialist damage and caused problems, but supremacist culture and sort of dominant culture mentality in general, that can pervade, and also just like nuanced experiences that maybe some people don't think about. Like, here's an example. Like, this may be something that could be a hard truth for some of us to sit in, but like, I've been in very progressive left-leaning spaces where a lot of folks who have had family several generations in the US who are, progressive, sort of left-leaning people, um, they tout this idea of like, oh, well, people in dictatorships or whatever, they've just been brainwashed by global anti-communist propaganda. When in reality, sometimes what these people are doing are talking over the lived oppression and violence that people authentically lived through, regardless of the agenda of their government at the time. Um, and regardless of the narrative that it fits for people, some very kind of armchair progressive folks are like, oh, well, it's like it's a weird political abstraction to them that oppression can take place and be valid, and
What
be
I've
something
learned.
to be a priority, to be listened to. Like, um or I don't know. I'm trying to find a way to word this that sounds less provocative than how it wants to come
Oh,
out.
just say it.
But I'll try to speak plainly about this. But I sort of feel like often, for example, in countries where it's like folks who are roughly the same color who are fighting each other, uh, folks in the US or the global north or the West, quote unquote, can lean a little bit more towards, well, that's a you guys problem, you know, as far as um, how much it affects them personally, you know? Um, so like just even that thought process, I never thought the nuance of where my parents came from and what their experiences were and what that intergenerational trauma passed down to me. I never thought that would be a factor in like interacting with people who like basically agree with me politically, right? But then it turned out to be a thing because it's like, oh no, like your guys's like global north slash western privilege is coming out right here, you know, when folks do that thing where they want to talk over what people have experienced. um so yeah, like
It's called
privilege,
triggers, and that's why it's called triggers in spiritual medicine, because what I
right.
find is like when we're triggered by something, right? Like when I'm working with somebody, I say, when we're triggered by something, is it something that happened in our life? Is it something that happened because of our parents or our ancestors? And when we look at like I said, I'm looking through the lens right now. I have a very clear understanding of like where my Russian and Ukrainian relatives and what they experience, but
Mm,
I there's something broken in my Irish ancestry, and I
mm,
haven't been able to really tap in there. And what I find is that we react in ways, and even like when I work with women, especially white women,
mhm, mhm,
the whole trigger response, or this, I'm going to go after this guy, or like the stupid stuff, right? And I
mhm.
go, but where does this stuff come from? Like, I'm always that curious one, like, but where does this stuff really come from? And when we really dig deep and we start unpacking things and we go, oh shit, like it's because da 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 da, right? And then you start to see things through a different lens. Like when I went and interviewed a friend of mine who was suffering from breast cancer, and I always had this thing with white women. I couldn't understand it. I really struggled with a lot of relationships with white women. There was always a lot of this, and I couldn't understand why. And I said the one thing I noticed is that the BIPOC communities that I'm a part of, or folks in other marginalized communities or immigrants, had much stronger relationships and communities in those situations. And I wanted to know, why do us white women don't have that? And when she said, well, it has to do with how the burning times of witches influence white women culture today. And I was like, damn, that's like 600 years or whatever it is. Like, when you really think about it, cultural conditioning over all those years of my ancestors, over and over and over again, maybe of my Irish more than my Russian Ukrainian. And you start thinking, and you start looking at things through a different lens. And I think that's the thing. When we start unpacking these things, we start seeing things differently that were originally in our blinders. And I think that's what we're here like this year, even though it's a shit show, like it looks like a shit show, but this is the calling in, right? It's the calling in to face these hard truths, to unpack some of these things so you don't keep passing it on generation after generation after generation. I mean, literally, our planet now is our great mother saying, please stop.
Yeah,
She's
absolutely.
saying, please stop,
Yeah.
take stock. Look at how you're behaving. Look at what's forming your belief systems. Look at what's forming your behaviors and your responses. And
Yeah,
it's all
and
in the
not
nuances.
only that, but it's like a lot of the political strong arming and the very I'll just say it, but sort of fascist tactic leaning, to the annihilation of anybody else type of mentality that specifically a lot of leadership all over this globe is putting forth during this time. I believe that at least to some degree, those are resource wars, because of the effects of climate change. A lot of what's been going on and been exacerbated, for example, I'm not sure if I'm mixing up what's been going on with the displacement in Congo versus Sudan, but like at least one of those displacements, as well as Lebanon's ongoing situation since 2020, like the pandemic and shutdowns and supply chain issues due to the pandemic affected a lot of countries like resource mobility and GDP and stuff like that. And the ripple effects are still being felt. And I believe that like the fight for control over those resources is part of what is drawing people to like a lot of authoritarian leadership, a lot of violent extremist leadership. Even if folks are sort of like, well, I don't do much in the realm of politics, but hey, check out this like extremist religious philosophy. That sounds like a great time. Like, you know,
That's the danger, right? Because the danger is a certain percentage of the population is going, they want to go with the most extreme because it's almost like trendy, right?
yes,
It's like it's because
yes,
it's trendy, not realizing like the very things of why you want like something to destabilize because the thing is not really going well. So you're looking for somebody that's so outlandish to destabilize that. You don't realize that that person's actually going to go after the very rights that you're trying to protect. And that's, but see, but like,
absolutely.
this is where making decisions based on fear versus really getting rooted and like, I always talk about getting centered, getting to know like your inner yes and your inner no, like getting reconnected to the body, which is like the megaphone to your spirit, your soul, and getting to know that because that's going to guide you to know, is this the right direction to go in? And knowing that you can't fix the whole, but you are a piece to the whole. So you need to be focused on how do I find where I go in my match to create the change in that ripple effect, right? And um, I see so much, there's so much polarity that I'm seeing. Like I also see like the spirit in the trees and the water and the fire is louder than I think I've ever seen in my life. So the earth is communicating with us for those that are tapped in such amazing, brilliant ways. And some of it I've been sharing on social media. They go, holy shit. Like I shared a cloud yesterday, literally a face giving a kiss. Like you can't make this up. Like it's not like I can't make this up. It just is. And it's like you have to sit there and go, there's something bigger at play here. So get out of the stories. If you really want to make change for humanity, you really want peace, then start taking the action steps and start looking at how can I face the hard truths so I can have the courage to overcome my fears? So I can help be an agent of change in the direction that I want to see the world. Instead of saying, well, oh, my neighbor will take care of that, or Joe Schmo will take care of that. We have this thing of hyper individualism in this country, but at the same time, we expect somebody else to deal with the bigger issues. So we don't have to, right? So, what would you say, coming through your lens, looking at the scope of things, especially from a spiritual perspective, what would you say the top three things people need to really either look at, or what steps, tips, or actions folks need to do to kind of move that needle into that direction?
Okay. Well, first of all, I would say identifying one concrete action that you can take every single day is a beautiful start. That might mean something just local to your community, not necessarily relevant to big overarching world events, or it might mean making some point of contact with a political official. It could mean casting a vote. It could mean calling a rep. It could mean sitting in on a diversity, equity, and inclusion panel. It could look like so many things, but maybe committing to just one action on the daily that you can self-empower with in that directionality. I also, and
By the way, if
this
I could
this
just
is sort
add,
of this is
if I
sort
could
of
add, it could be
oh
something even
yeah.
simple as like, you get an elderly neighbor, shovel out her driveway. Like, I mean,
Absolutely.
it's about stepping out of self and into community mode, which is something
Yes.
that has been intentionally stripped away from us as Americans, is
Mhm,
the concept of community,
mhm.
especially over the last 50 years.
Yes.
And we have to go back into what does community look like. If we're going to beat the bigger guy, we have to start locally. You're right. you
Yeah.
know Local gets
Absolutely.
bigger, and it's the ripple effect.
Yeah. Um, and by the way, that is in some way connected to this Jewish idea, tikkun olam, of restoring the world and basically, being action oriented like that on a regular basis to make things around you better. Um, it is, in my opinion, personal interpretation, it is basically a group or tribal obligation when it comes to the Jewish people. And I think it's an earthling obligation at this point. But yeah, as far as the second step, this is a really big one for me. Um, Listening to folks who are directly impacted by a severe or extreme event. Um, Listening to many folks who are directly impacted by a severe or extreme event. And that includes sitting with information that may not fit a narrative that you are holding at your center conveniently. Um, I certainly have dealt with this like over the past few months, like you can too. And it's like it's just so it's hard to just like casually yada yada like what's going on with the Israel Hamas war right now. Like that feels very screwed up to do. But like just as like a casual example, um like my personal experience with a lot of that stuff is so different from like your average Americans, your average Westerner, your average global North, because like I learned a little bit about what the Israelis call the 1948 war, like a little bit when I did some personal reading as a kid. But I was not confirmed in the Jewish faith. I didn't choose to get B'nai Mitzvahed, which is what happens when you come of age in the Jewish faith. I was neither going to do the Christianity nor Judaism thing at that point. I basically kind of decided to become a witch. So I didn't go through a lot of necessarily the learning about stuff, but because of my studies with Swana dance and dance ethnology, and my background with that, I actually learned about this term that some of your listeners may have heard now, the Nakba. I learned more information about that expulsion first, um, like more detailed information, I would say. And that is real unique, I think, to like being a global northerner and not being a person who is directly from there. So in the meantime, especially I would say over the past 6 years, I've done a lot of catch up work to catch up on hearing not just specifically Israeli perspectives, but that group of Middle Eastern or Swana Jewish people who have always had roots in the land, right? Like these were not the Ashkenazim from my ethnic background who were largely located to northeastern Europe for a long period of time, even though they were initially expelled from that land. But yeah, like these are, people who have had roots there and they experienced their own harm and expulsion and discrimination. So I caught myself up on a lot of that perspective. And then in addition to that, I've just been trying to listen to a lot of people directly affected by the war and the mass displacement right now because and obviously like a lot of specifically Gazan voices are harder to get in touch with a little bit because there has been so much censorship of the media by uh by Hamas, their ruling party. And that is not propaganda, like that is a fact that can be fact checked. um and so that is a hard truth, but just trying to listen across the board to people who have been directly affected, who have been or are on the ground. And obviously, this is not only relevant to Israel Palestine, but this is relevant to everywhere, to Sudan, Congo, like
I
Ukraine.
yeah, I mean, I can relate with the duality of my grandmother immigrating from Russia and and watching my grandfather's hometowns being bombed in Ukraine. And it's the duality within my own veins of the oppressor and the oppressed, you know? Um, and so there's a lot to sit with. And I think that's the thing. It's sit with, but also those that are being harmed are still being harmed. And I think and to
Mhm.
be mindful of
Absolutely.
the level of Darvo tactics that I am witnessing that is really, I think there's going to be textbooks written on it someday. Um, is really almost frightening because what I'm witnessing happening there is something that I've worked with victims that have a hard time getting heard in court for the same reasons,
Mhm.
you know? And so it's fascinating from one end, but you don't want to be fascinated with blood and gore and people suffering. It's not why it's fascinating. It's fascinating because I can understand and see the intersectionality from my limited lens and saying if they aren't free, we aren't free. Like
Mhm.
we can't be free until they're free. So I think that's something else we have to realize. If we
Right.
want to be free, we want our children, the things like the activism I do with children and domestic violence, it's like, how are we going to be free if they're not free? Because we have the same oppressor,
Absolutely. Yes.
you know? And
Yes.
I think that's where the
Absolutely.
unified voices need to come in, you know?
Well, and also, yes, and it's like when you listen to folks on the ground or folks who have at one point in recent times been directly affected, there will always be a diversity of perspectives. So I have spent a lot of time just sitting, interweaving all of these narratives and listening to a lot of different types of people talking about stuff. And obviously, you can sort of roll around the information. You don't have to assimilate it as yours personally. You can acknowledge that maybe somebody's information is coming from a place of deep trauma, or that there are a lot of mitigating factors but they're not your lived factors either. And that's why they're worth listening to, I think.
That's what we
And
call
it,
bearing witness, right? Like
yes,
you
yes.
can
And
sometimes there's power in just bearing witness and
mhm,
giving
mhm.
space.
Yes, yes. And like this goes back to, I think, what I was saying earlier with yeah, just like trying to listen with less of an objective, trying to listen with less of a reach towards confirmation bias, trying to listen just as like a fellow human. And then this is kind of, I think, what would be my third point here too, is like, I think we need to get critical, especially if we are frequent users of social media specifically, which I jokingly call anti-social media at this point. I have for a long time actually. But like if we are frequent users of social media, one sort of question that floated upwards in my consciousness recently is this question of where is the line or where is the balance between being authentically committed to bearing witness to somebody's experience or perspective or even pain or trauma, and then also kind of like, does that stop somewhere? And do I start consuming their trauma porn as a consumer? Because that is something, for example, that came up very heavily with a lot of police brutality, like here in the US, a lot of police brutality against Black people. Finally, the rhetoric emerged of like, hey, friends, like just a reminder, it's okay if you don't want to watch the video, like, especially multi-marginalized people, like, we need to uh establish right relationship to the information. And
Project and say that it also has to be consuming it is one thing, listening and bearing witness is one thing.
right,
But if you're going down the rabbit hole like an addictive drug, that is not helping you, nor is it
right.
fixing the problem. So it's what do you do with the information? I
Mhm.
think that's the key, right? I think that's like, okay, here's the information. Now what's your action step?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes. Hard to
Is
agree
that
with that.
action step because you're triggered
Mhm.
and it's triggering something in you because of your own personal religious bias? And maybe you have to do some self-reflection or your own white privilege or whatever it might be, right? Is it your trigger that's something you have to go and look within you? Or is it triggering like what I saw was triggering for me was I was surprised to see how triggered I was to see mothers and how it affected me, pleading and begging and seeing the lifeless bodies of babies and holding them. And it triggered me right back into a response that I personally experienced of trying to save my kids from family court, and family court didn't give a fuck, right? And feeling powerless to do anything to protect them.
Mhm.
And so now that I saw that intersectionality, what do I do with that? Well, first of all, it broadens my horizons on how to maybe see and talk about those things. But it also helps me when I go to testify again before the state legislator or my legislators on certain bills and things, I can speak on it from a different lens and a different angle
Mhm.
and hopefully bring awareness or address the bigger elephant in the room. It's knowing what's the action step? I've always said it's like stop, pause, breathe. What's the action step?
Right.
Seeing these things in bear witness also, this is historic. This is the first genocide that we are witnessing on social media that is outside of Standing Rock, because they tried to do that in Standing Rock. They tried to also do blackouts and everything at Standing Rock with
Well,
Facebook.
I slightly actually well, I beg to differ with that. I don't know exactly about the terminologies used, but just at I think it was like late 2022, early 20 or mid 2023.
Mm.
Most of the ethnic Armenians were expelled from Artsakh. And as a resident of Los Angeles, I feel like I'm legally obligated to bring that up because the Armenian diaspora community here is very vocal. Armenians do like consider themselves kind of an indigenous group to the Caucasus region. And it was a 100% of people expulsion. And not only that, but they were also under a blockade for, I think it was like basically late 2020 through at least 2022 or 23, and then just people mass exodus out of there. Like there are, to my understanding, there are no ethnic Armenians left in Artsakh. So it wasn't that everybody was exterminated immediately necessarily, but there was a blockade. There was hunger, and there, in differentiation from like a lot of the bullshit happening in Gaza, like there was an ability to airdrop supplies into Artsakh. But it was still a very extreme situation that was not sustainable. And yeah, eventually everybody was expelled, to my understanding. All of the ethnic Armenians were expelled. So I bore witness to some of that on social media. I know that wasn't necessarily on everybody's radar,
No,
but
I did wear witness to it too. I think I should have
Mhm.
clarified. I think this is the first event like this
Mhm.
that really actually gained momentum and attention.
Mhm.
There's always that one, because it's not always the first, because I can go all the way back to what happened in Standing Rock,
Mhm.
which if it wasn't for Facebook Live, we would have talked about a genocide of Native Americans at Standing Rock. But the only reason why that didn't happen was because of social media.
Right, right.
So, and so I think yeah, and I think it's also saying to the powers that be, hey, we're not buying your crap propaganda news anymore, you know? And I think the difference between that I see, like, I remember going to a political thing, I don't know, it was like 5 months ago or so. And the one thing that blew me away was seeing how many people that were there that were under the age of 20 and how many were there under the age of 18 saying, I am here because I'm going to vote next year and I want to
Mm.
know what's going on and I'm doing my work now. And I'm going,
Mhm.
oh my God, I know what I was doing at 17. I would just gave a shit about skipping school. I couldn't care less. And I'm going, this generation is giving me hope. Like, because my generation is still stuck to the old school, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, and the censorships are real, and
Yeah, I mean, I am I'm not a TikTok user. I'm just gonna say that now. And from some of what I've heard has floated around on TikTok, like isn't necessarily the savior to disinformation either.
no,
I
it's
think
not.
we need to kind of be real about that. But it is valuable that we have the ability to bear witness to and hear a lot of different perspectives.
Well, I
That
was, oh, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, no, just that like at this point in time, like I don't know. I don't know if it's really worked. Some of the social media platforms have said they're going to do some diligence with like dealing with bogus accounts. I don't know if
Well,
it's
all
worked,
I
but
know is that if it wasn't for TikTok, when it comes to the domestic violence community,
Mhm.
it is the only platform where survivors have a voice. Like, truly, like, almost an uncensored voice.
Mhm.
We helped save Maya and Sebastian last year, who were legally trafficked into a reunification camp, um, back to an abuser, and they basically disappeared for 7 months.
Mhm.
And it's because of a 15-year-old using TikTok, it gained momentum. My colleague, who was an ex-prosecutor in the state of New York, whose ex-husband or husband at the time, all you gotta do is do hashtag Catherine Kasanoff, like, it went viral because of TikTok, because an influencer picked up the story. I mean, she ended up dying, not from breast cancer, but ended up going to Switzerland and committing suicide because when she found out she was terminal, he went to court and terminated all contact between her and her kids. Like,
Mhm.
she's like, I can't fight cancer and him, where he spent $3 million and 3,000 motions in like 3 years. So for that is where I've seen it work.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, and I'm
And
not,
it's brilliant on that
writing it
end.
off. I'm not
Yeah.
writing it off
But
across
it
the
made me
board.
figure out, like, as an oldie going like, "How the hell do I use this?" Like, if
Yeah.
if they're making momentum, like, and getting things changed and getting judges to change orders because of TikTok,
Mhm.
how the hell do I use this? Like, and so I've only been trying to learn about it really in the past year or so, from an activism standpoint, but I always try to say I try to keep a curious eye. Well, yes, being mindful of, the AI aspect, because that is kind of scary for somebody like me.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I mean, I realize, of course, that not everything is available to every person, but for me, it has been helpful to actually like interact with a justice oriented community that is not tied to any of the social media apps, to get really local and to find or do outreach to, and maybe it starts by connecting on social media, but to get really local, to do outreach to, because for example, with some of the, tying this back to this, like some of the anti-LGBTQ backlash, like we have had neo-Nazis and Proud Boys like organize and rally and do the whatever they were calling it, like protect our kids from learning about Pride Month or something in school type of rallies. Like, um, there has been an urgent.
If they only knew that they're not rallying against their priests and pastors who have historically been the number one predator for children.
Right. That, well, that too, yeah. But it's a lot of um yeah, there's been a level of local urgency. There's always a level of local urgency, I think, for people to organize. So I think what's cool is like if social media has gotten to be a bit of an overwhelm for some folks, you can take a little step back and you can try to reach for what's more right there. And again, I totally realize like people dealing with disabilities have a lot of different needs and experiences. People who are still trying to be really COVID safe right now just because COVID is really bad again. They have a lot of considerations. But there's definitely still like not as social media focused stuff that is out there for you, that you can reach for. And it's also really interesting because it's like I don't have not to validate like an anti-LGBTQ stereotype. I don't happen to have a lot of children close to me in my life personally. I don't have a big family with people in my same generation. A lot of the folks with the younger kids who would be like my kids' generation don't live in this country. Um, So, in terms of my personal family, it's not there, but very recently I babysat for an 8-year-old. And I also have some friends who have that Gen Alpha age group of kids. As far as the Xennials, millennials, like Gen Alpha is our kids, and they're growing up now. They're getting to be like tweens, basically. Tweens and like on the cusp of teenagerhood now. And I forgot like just how super all 100% of the time they are interfaced with a piece of technology in front of their face. Because even I think certainly for but Xennials, millennials, we have technological pauses in our day, I think, but I forgot a little bit like how they're just like their screen is like they're part of them, like like that Teletubbies kid show, like they had the screen in their belly, right? Like
Bringing
I
back memories
forgot about
because,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, and
But I see
so
for people like me, like that didn't really come into my life until I was almost 30. So,
mhm.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
computers are just starting to come around, like Macs starting to come back when I was like, when I was in college, and then Microsoft came out when I was 22. And,
Right.
we didn't even really, internet was just a baby then.
And not to paint anything as all good or all bad, but this goes back to that like right relationship to conversation. I wonder, and I mean, this is me echoing something actually my partner said to me that I agreed with 100%, but like, I wonder about the epidemic of loneliness, or I wonder how these kids are going to be dealing with the concept of loneliness, or if they feel lonely,
Well,
or.
that is something that I know because the work I do, when I work with parents, it is coming up already.
Mhm.
The idea of loneliness. I do have some clients that are in their teens, and there is a lot of loneliness. And I think like you, to go and echo what you were saying earlier, is how can we continue to do things off of social media? And what I kept hearing, and when I mean hearing, like in my spirit voice or whatever you want to call it, is we need to get back to just inviting people over to have conversations. Go back to just say, "Hey, what are you doing Friday? Come on over. Let's just hang out and just have conversation. Not just sit there and watch a movie and play games, but actually engage in some sort of activism or some sort of what can we do? Let's have a conversation." Even if it's like you just got to get it off your chest and you want to engage and figure out how to do that in your area. Like that's where it's at again.
Yeah.
That's what we call grassroots, right?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because like one of my friends slash clients who hires me for a few hours a week, she started facilitating what she called Herbal Fun and Learning Day. And the principles behind this day sort of ended up an interesting mashup of an agroecology course that she went through, which has a lot of foundations in indigenous, like the foundations of indigenous stewardship of a given part of land, but also just like relationship to like food production and food growing and things like that. So her background in agroecology, um, and then also the principles of buy nothing, which if your listeners are not familiar with that, I encourage you to look up the Buy Nothing Project.org.
Also the buy nothing groups on Facebook now,
Yes.
like.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so combining the principles of agroecology, sort of the Buy Nothing Project, and then unofficially certain of these events, not every single one of them. It's dependent on the configuration of people, but like certain of these events have actually also turned into like community organizing. And like kind of activism leaning, but just like community networking, like, somebody I know who's an organizer got to like accidentally meet and network with somebody who they probably wouldn't have interacted with otherwise, who like lives down their block. And like got to basically kind of um strengthen their neighborhood network that way. um and so it sort of ended up facilitating like all of these things together. So I think that in-person community events, which again, I recognize in person may not be fully available to every individual out there. I totally get it. But in-person meets or community events that involve gifting economy or skill sharing, info sharing, giveaways, buy nothing swaps. Not only is it like awesomely kind of anti-capitalist, but like just to like watch what can unfold from these moments is very powerful and empowering, and can really help to shore up that sense of like, oh, I can make a difference, like I can have an impact, you know.
It's been we've covered so much in this 1 hour. It has been such a pleasure, having you on. How people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for folks to find you?
Well, I have a website. It should be linked in the info for the show. I am also on Instagram as DivinatX.io. Um, let's see what else. Uh, I do have a Blue Sky account, but what gets posted there is a really interesting. That's mostly like my performer and art stuff on there, but what gets posted there is an interesting weird combination of like it's just me being a human basically. It's a combination of like me trying to work on some of my stand-up comedy jokes, but also sharing about the art I co-create, random riffing about political issues, whatnot. It's kind of all over the map, but if you are a Blue Sky user, which is also a very nice alternative to Exeter, X, Twitter, shitter, whatever people are calling it these days, like the bad place, the Nazi fun site. I could keep going. But yeah, on Blue Sky, I am at L Faunt, FAUNT.BSKY.social. Folks want to look me up for all manner of cross section of weird musings. And yeah, my website will be linked. Yeah, people can people are welcome to reach out to me about things as long as they're not jerks. And yeah, also just kind of pulling back to that reminder of like, it's okay to take time to digest the information. Yes, take action, but like take informed action. It's okay to take time
Action.
to assimilate all of the inputs that we experience so very heavily in
Mhm.
our day to day. It's okay to want to listen to different kinds of people who are saying more than one thing. It's okay to sit with your discomfort if something comes up in a conversation that doesn't necessarily jive with like the narrative you were holding close to you. Um, it's okay to take breaks. It's okay to self-care. We should not be neglecting, to the best of our ability, self-care and self-protective and self-boundarying measures during this
It's
time
the
of
old saying, right? Of like, you got to put your own mask before you can put the mask on. To be able to do and make impact, you have to come from a place of power. So if you're drained and you're not well and all those things, you have to get yourself to a point where you can do it. So the breaks are important, you know. so you can be more effective. That's the key. It's not,
Yeah.
you know, you have to be in everybody's face every day. It's what can you do and being strategic about it.
Absolutely. And I also want to just one final thing remind us to like not lose our sense of play and humor. Like I had a moment where I had to kind of like self-check and was like a lot of my energy has been like sort of fried away by various external things. And when a traumatic global event happens, like it is authentically difficult, but like take those extra moments in your day to find play or to reach for something that makes you feel pleasure or makes you laugh or chuckle or to write out a write out like, okay, I have this term that sort of mutually me and a really good friend came up with. It's called show manic clowning. Show SHOWMANIC clowning. And it's that idea of the court jester, the one who says, hey, the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. Isn't that fucking absurd, you guys? And the ability to stand in that absurdity of like, we all share humanity, we all share pleasure, pain, suffering, to different degrees, hunger to some different degrees, marginalization, or moments where we all feel big or very small. To compassionately stand in that interrelationship of experience and to be able to like find the humor in that human experience. Mark Maron talks about there must have been stand-up comedians in Auschwitz and they must have been beloved because they were probably commenting on the absurdity of the situation. And I firmly believe that, and I think we can, to have that moment, that breath, that finding, if not a real smile from joy if things feel too heavy, because we don't want to bypass either, but finding a moment to just look at the ridiculousness or feel like the scathing satire of the absurdity of what we all are going through, that's always been very empowering to me. And your mileage may vary, but that's a place I like to reach for a lot of the time. It's a medicine that I reach for a lot of the time.
An absolute joy being here. Thank you so much. And for those who want to support our social justice initiatives or to support this podcast, please become a Patreon member. Links will be in the description. And until next time on Triggers and Spiritual Medicine, have a good day, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.